Welcome to another episode of Earth is Our Home with Dr. Thomas Blaine. Dr. Thomas Blaine is going to be looking in depth at what El Nino and La Nina are and how it affects us personally. So stay tuned. Welcome to another episode of Earth is Our Home with Dr. Thomas Blaine. He's an associate professor with the Ohio State University Extension Program. I'm looking forward to this particular program. We can ask him, where did El Nino go? Tom, it's always a pleasure talking with you.
Well, it's great to be here with you, Patrick. I really enjoy Earth is Our Home. Hope the audience is getting a lot out of it. And, today I'm really interested in talking. We've done before discussions of global circulation of air and water and how El Nino and La Nina fluctuate in the equatorial Pacific. But the data coming in now confirms that La Nina has ruled the roost pretty much over the last 25 years. We've discussed before about how El Nino and La Nina work. It's called the Southern Oscillation. But since I've started doing this, I've been doing Earth is Our Home now. This is June of 2022. I've been doing this now for well over a year. It's become clear that La Nina is pretty much in control. And I wanted to go over with you what's happened to El Nino. It's kind of vanished, and what the implications are for global climate. There's been a lot of speculation and misinformation in recent years. A lot of this is focused on an alleged pause in global warming since 1998. In 97, we had a very strong El Nino, and it pushed global temperatures way up above the trend. This alarmed a lot of people, but what happened after that was we went into a period now that started in 1998 or 99. Here we are in 22, in which La Nina has kind of taken over in the equatorial Pacific, and that has the tendency to cool temperatures. And yet we're still seeing global warming take place. It's just going at a much slower pace than it would otherwise do, which has caused a lot of people, skeptics, you might call them, or contrarians, to say, oh, global warming is not going at the pace that people had said. But I want to go over the fact that that's only because we're in a cycle of very strong La Ninas. And also, this has impacts for extreme weather events that we've seen. What you're going to learn here is that in the 80s and 90s, the Southern Oscillation in the equatorial Pacific was dominated by El Ninos. That tended to make temperatures go up faster than ordinary. This trend's reversed over the past 25 years. You tend not to hear this on the media. You hear a lot of discussion about pauses in global warming and extreme weather events. But even though you might hear people talking about El Nino and La Nina, very few people that I've seen, I haven't seen anybody in the media put this in perspective the way that I'm going to do today here for you. Now, remember, the cycles of El Nino and La Nina are referred to as the Southern Oscillation. Now, we've discussed this. It's ENSO. ENSO stands for El Nino Southern Oscillation. If you've forgotten that, if it's gotten into your memory somehow and you can't recall exactly the difference between El Nino and La Nina, relax. We're going to review that today. This is a 3-part series on Nina Rules the Roost. And in today's program, we're going to review the principles of global circulation that include El Nino and the southern oscillation. Then we're going to take a look at the actual cycles over the past 40 plus years, note their influence on temperature and climate trends, and we're going to examine the current La Nina and the effects it's having on all these variables. So to review, basically, if you look at this, I know that's a lot of information, but if you look way out to the right where it says Hadley cell and way out to the left where it says Hadley cell, just remember that essentially at the equator, air tends to rise. And if you look inside those Hadley cells, that there's really that Hadley cell in the northern hemisphere is a band around the Earth from about the equator up to about 30 degrees north. And then from the equator to about 30 degrees south, it's a band, the two Hadley cells, the northern and the southern, in which, as you see in the arrows way out off the planet, it shows that air is flowing from about 30 degrees toward the equator. In other words, it's flowing out of the north toward the equator in the northern hemisphere, out of the south toward the equator in the southern hemisphere. In the northern hemisphere, it's going from 30 degrees north, roughly, down to the equator and then rising. And then it's flowing toward the equator from 30 degrees south, and then it rises. So that's low pressure. When we take into consideration the rotation of the Earth, we have what's called the Coriolis Effect. If you want, we're going to put the link to the two-part series we did in July of 2021 on the Coriolis Effect. The Coriolis Effect means if you take a look on the planet now, get away from that up in the Hadley cell and go look on the middle of the screen from 30 degrees north as those winds come down toward the equator, and also from 30 degrees south as they come up toward the equator, all those winds are bent. They bend. They don't come straight because the Earth is turning. That is the Coriolis effect, which causes things in the northern hemisphere to bend to the right. Now, I said that correctly. If you're at 30 degrees north latitude, imagine you're riding on that wind and you're coming toward the equator from 30 degrees north toward the equator. If you bend to the right, that means you go to the west. You go to the west from northeast to southwest. In the southern hemisphere, the Coriolis effect bends things to the left. If you look at any wind in the southern hemisphere and you're imagine riding it, you will be bent to the left. So if you're at 30 degrees south latitude and you're going up toward the equator, you get bent to the left, which basically means if you're in the left in the southern hemisphere and in the right in the northern hemisphere, you're going to go in the same direction, which means east to west. Those particular winds along the equator that go from east to west are called the trade winds. Those are the trade winds. And they do that all around the earth. They're called the trade winds from back in the day of sailing. If you were trading between the Americas and Europe, for example, you needed to have a good understanding of the trade winds, so the merchants understood those winds very well and how to navigate them. If you didn't, you weren't going to be a successful sailor or merchant. Here's another look. Patrick, have a look at the trade winds there. Notice they're coming out of the northeast. The main factor, again, you'll see the Hadley cells up off the planet. They're just put there so you can see them separately. the tendency is for air to blow toward the equator in the tropics. That's both in the northern hemisphere and the southern hemisphere, blow toward the equator. But the spinning of the earth causes that movement of air toward the equator to be bent from east to west, both in the northern hemisphere and in the southern hemisphere. Those are the trade winds. When we had sailing vessels, as long as you have wind, you can pretty much go in any direction. In other words, you don't need the wind to be blowing from behind. That's something that you learn in sailing. Like, for example, if you're wanting to go in the direction that the wind is blowing, you want to go against the wind, you can do that in a sailing vessel by altering the configuration of the sails on the ship. In other words, a sailor that knows what direction the winds are coming from can sail in pretty much any direction they want to go in. They reconfigure the sails. That's why sailing is such a skill. But if you look at this map, you'll see that at about 30 degrees north latitude, you've got the westerlies tending to take wind one way and the trade winds taking it another way, which means a lot of times that's an area right in between the westerlies and the trade winds. That's an area where you can get a lot of calm. And that was a real challenge for sailors back in those days. They wanted to avoid that at all costs. They did not want to get into that area. You try to get across that area as quickly as possible. That's why the knowledge of the trade winds was so important. You wanted to be in the wind and you want to avoid those doldrums. But it's true that a lot of the trade went with those winds. In other words, they would bring things from Africa. And unfortunately, a lot of that was slaves. The slaves, they would kidnap people in Africa and put them on ships, and they were going with the trade winds to bring them to the Americas. And then they would ride the westerlies where they would pick up items in the Caribbean like sugar and rum and all those kinds of things and ride off to Great Britain. And so they would be going with the westerlies there. And then the final leg of the triangle going back down to Africa. It was a big triangle that they sailed. So a lot of times, yes, they did go with the winds. But the main thing you want to avoid if you're a sailor really is the doldrums, calm. Anyway, to summarize, air in the tropics tends to flow toward the equator from about 30 degrees north and 30 degrees south. This is Hadley cell circulation. This whole trend, by the way, can be reversed by the presence of land masses and like large islands, continents, but it holds true in general, and especially in the middle parts of oceans. I kind of have this map where, we're ignoring the impact of continents a little bit, but especially in the middle of oceans where El Nino and La Nina are going to take place. I wanted to make sure you understand that. The latitude also can change a little bit. In the summer, that 30 degrees moves a little bit north, and in the winter, it moves south because of differences in heat. The main deviation, though, is that we've got to remember is the Coriolis effect. Those winds coming from 30 degrees north or 30 degrees south, they're bent by the Coriolis. And again, we've got the link to 2 different videos on the Coriolis effect down below, which explain why those winds rushing toward the equator get twisted as though they're going from east to west. The Earth turns once a day, one rotation per day. But the Earth, as you know, is a sphere, so it's much bigger near the equator, 24,000 miles. So it has to go 1,000 miles an hour at the equator, speed of rotation. Whereas at the poles, it's not moving at all. And about where we are in Ohio, it's about 800 miles an hour because it's not as far around the Earth here in Ohio. It doesn't have as far to rotate as it does at the equator. Here's another look at the trade winds I wanted to show you without all the other stuff. Horse latitudes are those latitudes that I mentioned where you tend to get a lot of calm. Different stories about how it got to be named horse latitudes. If you had excess weight and you weren't going anywhere, you might throw your horses overboard in the sea back then because of not being able to get anywhere if you get stuck in those doldrums. But if you get where the trade winds are, you could make pretty good timing back then. And so the trade winds are very important for us now. If we look at ocean circulation along the equator, let's look there. You notice that it mimics the trade winds. The circulation of the water in the ocean tends to flow near the equator from the Americas out toward Asia at the equator, mimicking the trade winds. Now notice there's a clockwise flow in the northern Pacific. That's all the northern hemispheric oceans. In the southern hemisphere, it's counterclockwise. So the water up north flows from Asia toward the Americas. But that is not related to El Nino and La Nina. What we're focusing on today is the tendency of currents near the equator to blow from east to flow, I should say. The currents flow and the winds blow, but they all go from east to west near the equator. They tend to. They're mimicking the trade winds. And what this means is the water in the western equatorial Pacific will be much warmer. If you look there, think about water off the coast of, say, Peru or Ecuador in South America. That water is going to be cold because it's just come up off the coast of Antarctica. You can see the flow. Icy cold water off the coast of Antarctica. And also similarly in the northern hemisphere, you got cold water coming from Alaska down toward the equator. But the longer that water stays near the equator as it goes from east to west, the warmer it gets. So by the time it gets out in the western Pacific, it can be 5, 6, 7 degrees warmer than the water off the coast of South America. That is, the water near Indonesia, the Philippines will be much warmer than water off the west coast of South America. Here's another look at it. And you can see that cool water off the coast of South America. And then as it goes along with strong trade winds, you get warm water and low pressure in the portion of the Pacific near Asia. La Nina is just an exaggeration of this somewhat normal condition. When high pressure builds in the eastern equatorial Pacific, that high pressure builds and drives the trade winds even stronger than normal, you're going to have cold water pushing out from the Americas. The trade winds are going to push that cold water, and it's going to go out and cool down the water across much of the equatorial Pacific. So this is a situation here where we've built into a La Nina. Notice how small the patch of warm water is, that red in the portion of the Pacific way out there toward Asia. And here is a map with satellite, taken from satellite data showing a classic La Nina. Look at all the cold water in the equatorial Pacific. That's blue. That's a very classic La Nina. Now, the thing about it is, this really only happens in the Pacific. If you look at the Atlantic, you'll notice it's just not that far from the eastern Atlantic at the equator at Africa over to South America. And we saw one of the Indian Ocean too. We had that flow in the Indian Ocean. You see, it's not that far across the equator in the Indian Ocean, but it is far in the Pacific. And because of that, when we talk about El Nino and this phenomenon of La Nina and the Southern Oscillation, we're really only talking about in the Pacific. So here are water temperatures during an El Nino when the situation reverses and you have high pressure in the Western Pacific and the trade winds weaken. So you've all seen a surface weather map where it shows a high pressure system coming through and a low pressure system. That happens also in the equatorial Pacific. When we get high pressure building in the Western Pacific and it causes the trade winds to die down or even to reverse, and there it is on the top, Patrick, if you look there, notice the winds on that top diagram. What we've got, a reversal. Notice those winds are going against the fundamental tendency of the trade winds because there's high pressure built into the Western Pacific and it drives warm water toward the Americas. That really changes everything. And what it does is it heats up the entire atmosphere of planet Earth because it uncovers so much warm water and puts it on the surface of the equatorial Pacific all the way toward the Americas that interacts with the air and warms up the air temperature that spreads all around the Earth. The La Nina that we talked about, the classic one, is on the bottom. Here's another look. You can see what happens during an El Nino. These are globes. And you can see this is the equatorial Pacific. If you look way up to the right on each one, you can see North America, at least the western portion of North America. And so in an El Nino, you got a lot of warm water there near the equator. La Nina, you got a lot of cold water. And again, what happens in the equatorial Pacific doesn't stay in the equatorial Pacific. When the La Nina brings cold water across there, that cold water interacts with the air and cools the air down. And then the air circulates all around the world, as we showed back in that air circulation model. That cold air adding the cold causes temperatures to fall. So now I want you to look. This is data since 1979 on the Southern Oscillation. Red, of course, means El Nino. Red is El Nino because that's warmth. That's when the equatorial Pacific has tended to be very warm. And the blue is La Nina. Notice we've been in a La Nina now constantly since 2020. Over 2 years that we've been in a La Nina. If you look out there to the right, and notice the El Nino that preceded that was extremely weak. Wasn't much of an El Nino compared to other El Ninos. It wasn't much. Prior to that was another pretty strong La Nina. If you go back to 2010 to about 2014, a lot of La Nina. Then we did have a strong El Nino around 2015 and 2016. But in general, if you look at this chart, you'll see that to the left of center, there's more red. And to the right of center, there's more blue, which means the El Ninos tended to rule the roost in the 80s and 90s. And a lot of people thought that was going to be a permanent feature now associated with global warming, that the warming of the planet would be enhanced by more El Ninos coming along and putting more heat into the atmosphere. But so far in the past 25 years, that hasn't happened. In fact, La Nina is what is responsible largely for keeping the trend in global warming down a little bit. In other words, if we go back into a scenario where El Nino rules the roost again, we can look for the global average temperatures to start to reaccelerate. La Nina has bought us time here and kept temperatures down from what they would be. And we're going to talk about that quite a bit in the next program.
We're talking with Dr. Thomas Blaine. He's an associate professor with the Ohio State University Extension Program. Tom, thank you.
Thanks a lot for having me.